So this happened to me when I was around 6 or 7, and I'm unsure if it was just a crazy dream or a false memory. But here it goes. When I was young, aforementioned 6 or 7, my grandparents and I took a trip to my great-grandparents' house for a family reunion style get-together. We stayed for 5 days, and the days were fun, but the nights were a different story altogether. I was set to sleep in a spare room on some rickety old bunk beds with my older, I think she was 9, cousin Lori. She took the bottom bunk, and I took the top, because everybody knows that the top bunk is cooler. Literally, the house had no air conditioning, and it was closer to the ceiling fan. Lori's mom was out of work and had been staying with my great-grandma to get back on track and try to find a job. Across from the bunk beds, there was a big hole in the wall where I was told my great-uncle Buck had fallen down trying to roller skate in the house, and his elbow had gone through the wall. The first night I slept there, nothing happened, or if it did, I was just so sleepy from the long drive that I didn't notice. But the second night, I got really freaked out. After Lori and I got in our bunks and Mom turned the lights out, I didn't fall asleep for a while. And when I did, I woke up almost immediately. The room was dark, and when I rolled over to try and look down at the clock on the opposite wall, my eyes were drawn to the hole. It took me a minute to realize what I was seeing. There was something lighter colored moving in the hole. You know how at night, when it's really dark, you can kind of see light or white things? Something in the hole was moving. Something white. I leaned and squinted, trying to see what it was. Eventually, it got still, and I realized it was a fucking eyeball. Imagine if you were to look into a dollhouse through a hole you made in the wall of it. It was like I was a doll inside, and this huge fucking eyeball was looking through the hole. The white I saw moving was the white of the eye, growing larger and smaller as the pupil looked around different parts of the room. Now, the hole in the wall wasn't tiny. I'd say it was the size of a dinner plate. So for the eye to take up so much of it that I couldn't see the whole thing, it had to be huge. I was paralyzed with fear and pulled the covers up over my head and lay there sweating in total silence until I eventually fell asleep and morning came. If it had just happened once, I'd say it was just a bizarre dream. But every night that I slept in that room, the eye came back. I'd fall asleep and then jolt awake later, and there it would be in the hole, and I'd be too scared to move. It's a miracle I didn't wet the bed, because if I did, I'd have been too scared to move. I never mentioned it to my grandparents because I was convinced that they'd think it was bad dreams and take away my TV privileges. Isn't it messed up how as a kid, you're more concerned with losing TV access than something that was scaring you so bad at night that you were paralyzed? I did, however, bring it up with Lori on our last day there, and I'll never forget what she said to me, even though it's been 20 years. She looked me in the face, not laughing, and said, "It's okay, he can't get through there, he's too big." To this day, I have no idea what she meant by this. Who is he? Did she see it too? I would have thought she was teasing me, but she said it in such a matter-of-fact way that I didn't. And I still don't know how to take it. Years later, I asked her about it, and she claims to not remember the incident at all. This has led me to speculate that maybe it was just a reoccurring dream that I had as a child, or just a false memory, but I don't know. It's something that has stuck with me in a way that some of the other childhood nightmares I had have not. This story is definitely going to be hard to believe, but it's 100% true. It's a story that I've told very few people in real life, because I know how crazy it sounds. I know people here have had weird experiences too, and a lot of you know more about folklore and entities than I do. Hopefully, some of you can help explain what I saw. I'd love to hear your theories. This occurred when I was 11 or 12. I'm 28 now, and I was staying the night at my friend Danny's house, who lived just a few houses down from mine. There was a large pond behind our neighborhood, and we spent a lot of time there growing up. We go fishing, ride bikes, explore the small forest, etc. But we really enjoyed catching turtles and tree frogs. It might sound weird, but what can I say? We had somewhat of an obsession with reptiles and amphibians. Another thing I should note is that there's an old Native American trail that went through the backyards on our street. It wasn't the Trail of Tears, but it was related to it in some way. I don't really remember. Back to the story. I was up late playing video games with Danny, and after a while, we wanted to do something else. It was close to midnight, but we decided to go out and try catching some tree frogs. A family that lived in a nearby house had gone on vacation, and they had a perfect backyard for catching frogs. We hopped their fence and started exploring. Almost immediately, I started getting a weird feeling. I had the feeling we were being watched, or something was nearby, and there was this odd energy in the air. I don't really know how to explain it, but something just felt off. I remember feeling afraid, but I had no reason to be. We had done this kind of thing many times before, and it never inspired fear. About 10 minutes in, we thought we could hear the frog saying "help me" in a croaky, froggy voice, over and over again. The weird thing was, we couldn't see any tree frogs with our flashlights, and the yard wasn't that big. They started chanting in unison, and that made it much louder. Feeling more than a little creeped out, we bolted out of there and back to the street. Now, we were standing under a streetlight on the street corner across from where the frog house was. I looked up at the light and noticed at least 15 dragonflies attached to each other like a human centipede. They were all doing a spiraling motion as they flew closer and closer to the light. It was weird. So, we heard and saw two unusual things, but you could possibly explain them away. What happened next, however, made absolutely zero fucking sense. After the dragonflies did their thing and flew away, Danny and I remained standing under that streetlight. We began talking about the strangeness of the frogs in particular. We both heard them croaking the same phrase, and we were pretty much just saying what the fuck was that about. At some point during the conversation, I was instantly overcome with the most intense adrenaline rush that I've ever had in my life. That feeling of fear without a source while at the frog house was back, but much, much stronger. It was like my fight or flight response was signaled for no reason. Once again, everything felt off, and it felt like there was an intense energy all around us, making the air heavy. I was terrified, and I found out later my buddy was feeling the same thing. I became as still as possible, listening intently to my surroundings. I didn't hear anything unusual, but I suddenly began to feel drawn to look at the street behind me. I knew something was there. Whatever was behind me was the source of my fear, and it was putting out overwhelming energy with its presence alone. I hesitantly turned around and looked. Side note, I have full-body goosebumps just recalling this. In the middle of the street, about 20 yards away from us, there was an ordinary-looking 5 to 7-year-old girl with long, dark black hair wearing a white nightgown. She was sitting Indian style on the street pavement with a doll on her lap, and she was combing the doll's hair with a hairbrush. I was pretty much terrified beyond imagination. I was frozen with fear and could barely think straight. There was an incredible amount of energy in the air, and I knew something wasn't natural. She looked innocent enough, but I felt like she could snap me in half with the snap of her fingers if she really wanted to. Another creepy detail was that she never even looked at us. She kept her head down and focused on her doll, but she definitely knew that we were watching her. After what felt like an hour, realistically, probably 15 to 30 seconds, a car turned onto the street and began heading down the hill toward the girl. I remember the headlights getting brighter and brighter as it approached her. You would think maybe I would try to save her real quick, but I legitimately couldn't move. Also, I didn't really expect her to get hit for some reason. I never felt like she was in any sort of danger. Eventually, she became lost in the car's headlights, never looking up from her doll this whole time, by the way, and the car just passed right through her without any sound of a collision. It stopped at the stop sign 15 feet from us and made a right turn. We took our eyes off of where the girl was as we watched the car turn. When we looked back to where the girl had been, she was gone. Instead, there was a dog on the sidewalk, precisely parallel to where the girl was sitting in the street. The dog was looking right at me when I noticed it, almost like it was waiting for me to see it. Then, it just turned around and trotted up the hill in the other direction. After a few seconds, the shock wore off and we sprinted back to Danny's house and spent half the night looking out his second-story window toward the street. I don't know what I saw, but Danny saw the exact same thing. I've always felt like there was a reason it happened, or a reason it showed itself, whatever it was, to us of all people. Last thing, the house in front of where the girl was seen was haunted. I lived on that street for 10 years, and 4 or 5 different families lived in the haunted house during those 10 years. All of them said it was haunted. I have a couple stories about that too, but this is already way longer than I wanted it to be. Anyway, thanks for listening if you made it this far. Please let me know if you have any theories on my experience. This story is something that happened to my grandma and grandpa when they were a young couple. It was in North Florida in the 1930s. They had gone out, and my grandma's brother and his wife were with them. It was late, and they were going down a long road through the woods. Up ahead, they started to see a green glowing light in the distance, kind of off to the side of the road. As they got closer, they realized it was something floating just above the ground, over the ditch that ran alongside of the road, and it was moving toward them. They stopped the car and waited for it to get closer so they could see what it was. As it got near them, they realized it was a man in a long coat of some sort, and he had on a fedora hat. He was glowing green and was floating above the ditch. He was in the air high enough that they didn't mistake missing his feet. They watched him float by, and as soon as he got past their car, he started moving faster and then eventually disappeared. They all 4 saw it, and my grandma always wondered what it could have been. My first guess would be an extraterrestrial, if they do exist. I found it in a box of old VHS tapes I picked up from a flea market. I hunt for deals there. Sellers are often just looking to unload the crap that sits around off their hands. I buy in bulk, then check the goods, tossing out duds and ensuring items work, are clean and include the necessary pieces, before jacking the price and selling them on eBay. Videotapes are usually a minimal profit at best, but I've found rare items, first releases, Black Diamond Edition Disneys, and rare cover versions that collectors eat up. At any rate, I picked up a large box of tapes that looked to be in great condition for $5, and it wasn't until I got home that I started checking them thoroughly. When I did, I found a standard black video cassette tape missing a box. Normally, these don't interest me because they're usually unsaleable. Secondly, this had no standard label, so it was likely some home movie. What stopped me from tossing it right then and there was the black strip punch label stuck to the back that read 23-2-11 in blocky white raised numbers. I suspected from the dating system it was European, and when it didn't play on my NTSC VCR, that confirmed it. I huffed as I returned to my closet and fetched the European PAL deck. It was only 6 p.m. and I had time to kill, so I popped the tape into my old VHS player and pressed play. The footage was black and white, shot high up from the center of a room where the wall met the ceiling. The camera was pointed down to a thin woman hunched over in a wheelchair. Based on the angle and the stillness of the footage, it was clearly her surveillance feed. The footage was grainy, but I could see the seated woman looking disheveled. Her gray chin-length hair was matted and messy, and she appeared to be dressed in a filthy hospital gown. The way the woman was positioned looked still and unnatural. I quickly realized her wrists and ankles were bound to the wheelchair with straps. Both the walls and floors were padded with quilted square cushioning, and the door behind her had a slot in it, resembling something out of a mental hospital or maximum security prison. Just a second after the recording began, the bound woman raised her head and looked directly into the camera. I immediately felt a growing sense of dread as the intense stare of the woman burned into my retinas. Some primal part of my brain awoke and implored me to get away. But I just watched as curiosity and fear mingled into an all-encompassing wave of building anxiety. The woman just sat in her chair staring, but I felt my mouth begin to dry and my breath felt abrasive. My sinuses burned, and soon I felt the patter of liquid onto my lap from my nose, but I couldn't turn away from the screen. I heard a rapid tapping, and it took a few seconds of trying to understand the sound before I realized it was the chattering of my teeth. I was shivering, and my arms and legs trembled as I watched the woman on the screen tilt her head to one side, as if observing me through the screen itself. That feeling of impending danger heightened, and I wanted to turn it off at that point, but I just kept watching as the woman began fidgeting in the wheelchair's restraints. She was becoming progressively more agitated, thrashing until the chair began to rock between the two large wheels. After a few minutes, she opened her mouth and began to scream. The tape was silent, but I swear I could hear her faintly, though not through the speakers. It was like she was screaming from inside my head, small and muffled, from deep under the folds of my brain. I felt my lips crack in stinging slivers. I began to wonder just how long I'd been watching the tape, but I was enthralled by the unsettling footage, unable to stop it. Eventually, the door to her room opened, and two large men in white uniforms entered her padded cell. One was shorter with a shaved head and stocky build, the other taller with a slender frame and a face framed by dark bangs. The tall man began holding his head in apparent agony, screaming and then dropping to his knees on the padded floor. He remained there as the shorter guy struggled to remove the cat from a syringe. I only then noticed the subtle relief my own body experienced. It was as if whatever had taken hold of me, the intense dryness in my throat, a pulsing headache and the palpable dread, had redirected his focus. The man on his knees began to shiver, and soon enough, his nose streamed down a dark rivulet of blood. The shorter character with a shaved head had uncapped the syringe but was clearly struggling. His right arm drew it closer, needle first, towards his own eye. His left was gripping his other wrist, struggling to redirect its course. I watched in horror as the tip punctured his eye, just a centimeter or so. He seemed to regain control and quickly removed it. He then stabbed the needle into the bound woman's shoulder and pressed the plunger fully down. The feeling of intensity seemed to wash away from both the on-screen characters and myself. Euphoria set in as my previous state of dry, labored breathing and chest pains left me. The two workers at the hospital, prison, or other such facility both seemed to recover as well, the one helping his cohort to his feet. The two men left the room, securing the sturdy door behind them. I watched for a few minutes as the woman in the wheelchair slouched and then dropped her head. She looked to be asleep, or at least heavily sedated. She remained that way for a good minute or two after the men had cleared out. I watched her slack body for a few more minutes in utter fascination, until the tape reached the end and stopped with an audible click. The intense anxiety dissipated completely, and I only then realized how absolutely drastic the shift in my own state had been. I felt as if I'd been desiccated, every ounce of water in me sucked out, yet my nose was wet and dribbling down my chin. When I wiped it instinctively with the back of my hand, I saw that it was blood. There were dark red spots on my lap as well from where it had poured during the viewing of the tape. I stood up, and my muscles ached and groaned. I glanced at my phone for the time, and stopped in my place, my jaw agape. The time read 6, the same time I started watching the tape. I was about to chalk it up to a glitch when it changed to 6:01. There was no shadow of a doubt in my mind that I'd watched the tape for a good 10 minutes or so. I stretched my aching muscles and walked to the bathroom to clean my bloody nose. I downed a quart or so of water, dying of thirst. I waited a few days before even considering watching the tape again. When I did, everything that secured my knowledge of the world I knew seemed to crumble. It was a sunny afternoon a week later when I built up the courage to watch the tape again. I just felt the urge to confirm what I experienced was real and not some effect of delayed food poisoning, an allergic reaction, or some other bizarre coincidence. I popped the cassette tape and rewound it, which took only seconds. When I stopped, I pressed play. The woman bound to a wheelchair once again appeared on the screen, and a foreboding feeling of dread began to simmer inside of me. Something was different though. The woman was askew, facing the camera still, but at a slightly different angle, as if the wheelchair had shifted. On the floor behind her, black spots where the guard had yet to collapse were on the floor. It was as if the tape was showing a continuation of what had previously been recorded. My palms began to sweat, and my throat dried like an arid desert as I watched the woman staring into the camera once again. Her hair was shorter, trimmed down unevenly as if someone had hastily clipped the matted patches and knots. I knew it was impossible, but the tape appeared to be now showing a different recording altogether. Then, she looked up at the camera and I felt it again. My throat swelled and dried, and my breath began to burn. Her dark eyes locked onto mine through the screen. I felt the spasm in my arms and legs as they began to shiver. My sinuses flooded, and my nose began dribbling out a thin stream of blood, which dripped rhythmically onto my shirt. I watched, unable to peel my eyes away, as the woman in the wheelchair yanked her spindly arms, snapping her restraints. I let out a yell as she stood up fully, revealing her filthy hospital gown. She walked slowly toward the camera, and her wrinkles came into view through the fuzzy tape. Her features looked young, but her pale skin was wrinkled and speckled with burst capillaries. Her eyes were milky with cataracts and looked wild with excitement. She drew closer, getting larger on screen until her face was clear, and she mouthed something I swear I could hear inside of my head. She spoke the words, "Je te vois," and a hint of a smile crept onto her face before the tape clicked to a stop. I haven't yet worked up the nerve to watch it again. I bled a significant amount during the second viewing, and I'm frankly scared of the videotape. I attempted to make a copy, but it showed nothing but a black screen when I played it. I even tried recording it with my phone, but the TV screen in the video was black aside from a flicker. What I just can't shake are those words she'd spoken that resonated from deep within my skull. They're French, and they translate to, "I see you." I was maybe 8 or 9 years old. Me and my little sister, 2 years younger, shared a room, and we had a bunk bed. Me being the oldest, I had the top bunk. One night I woke up. It was dark, but the bed faced the window, so I could see the street lamps outside, giving the room some light. And I saw, sitting by my feet, staring at me, some black figure, almost childlike in appearance, but with glowing eyes. They were glowing black. It looked like it was made out of darkness. I don't know how to describe it. I was so confused and scared. Just a feeling of ice running through my spine. It tilted its head, and then smiled at me. And suddenly, my sister starts to scream her lungs out. With that thing sitting by the stairs in the bunk bed, I just jumped down from the top bunk. Fortunate for me, we had a lot of stuffed toys on the floor I landed on. I grabbed my sister, and we just bolted out of the room. Our parents just thought it was a nightmare, of course. I had trouble sleeping for weeks after that. I asked my sister about it like 10 years afterwards. Her response was that she had a nightmare where I got hurt by the Starless, and after that, I started to hurt others. And she remembered it because I woke her up by picking her up and running out of the room. She was, of course, confused why I would do that, when normally, when she had a nightmare, I would just lay down in the same bed as her, and we'd curl up together until she fell asleep again. She has no memory of her screaming, but I remember it as she was already sitting up in her bed when I landed on the floor. What the fuck was that thing? Do you guys have any theories?